That was me. The small girl frozen upon the pavement as a plain white sheet swallowed the last of my mother. I was 12 years of age on that fateful day, and now, more than a decade hence, I recall it with a clarity that still feels a theft of breath. I could not have put a name to the feeling then, that great gaping hollowness in my chest. I knew only that I was cold, confused, and utterly alone. I understand it better now, of course. It was the very sound of my life being cleaved in two. But before it was broken, there was a life with her, a life of lavender water and sad, hummed melodies in the half-light of our lodgings. Before the silence, there was her. We resided at the top of the house on Crimson Lane, in 2 rooms that were ever filled with either too much sun or too many shadows. To the world, the establishment was known as a brothel, a place of ill repute spoken of in hushed, condemning whispers. To me, it was simply home. It smelt of Madame Fleuret's strong rose perfume, the sweet, cloying scent of cigar smoke from the parlour below, and, in our own rooms, the clean, calming scent of the lavender water my mother would dab upon her wrists. Our home was not the sound of wickedness. It was the muffled notes of a distant pianoforte, the low murmur of gentlemen's voices in the hall, and the rustle of silk skirts as the other women passed our door. They were always quite kind to me, smiling and calling me her little sparrow, sometimes slipping me a sugared confection from a box a patron had given them. My mother, Ruth, was the quietest soul in that noisy house. She possessed a beauty that was almost painful to behold, with hair the colour of dark honey, and eyes that held a permanent sadness, even when she smiled. And her smile, I soon learned, was a treasure reserved for me alone. Our life was a collection of small, private rituals. She would devote an hour each morning to brushing and braiding my hair, her fingers both gentle and sure. In the afternoons she would read to me from her one-worn book of poems, her voice soft and rhythmic, a lullaby against the life of the house. We were an island, the two of us, in a sea of ceaseless comings and goings. The men who came to call upon her were merely part of that tide. They were shadows in fine coats, their faces of no consequence. They brought flowers that would wilt in a day, or expensive chocolates I was never permitted to touch. They would speak my mother's name like a prayer or a curse, and then they would be gone. I learned not to ask after them. I learned that my mother's life was divided. The part that was mine, and the part that was not. There was one gentleman, however, who was different. My mother instructed me to call him Uncle. He was not like the others. He never brought wilting flowers or ostentatious gifts. He was an older man, with kind eyes that held some of the same sorrow as my mother's, and he never carried the scent of brandy. He would arrive on Tuesday afternoons, and his visits were always quiet. Often, he and my mother would not speak at all. She would continue with her sewing by the window, and he would sit in the armchair, simply observing her as if the sight of her was all he required. He always had a peppermint humbug for me, which he would press into my palm with a solemn wink. He was a still point in our turning world, a silent promise that not all men were fleeting shadows. My mother's sadness seemed to lessen when he was present, her shoulders relaxing just a fraction. I did not comprehend his connection to her, only that he felt like a tether to something solid and decent. The illness arrived like an unwelcome caller in early autumn. It began as a cough, a small, dry sound she would attempt to stifle behind her hand. Then came the weariness, a weight that pulled at her eyelids and slowed her graceful movements. She insisted it was nothing, a simple chill, and would smile at me, but the light in her eyes was dimming. I would watch her press a cool hand to her own forehead when she thought me otherwise occupied. The scent of lavender began to mingle with the bitter, medicinal smell of the tonics Madame Fleuret brought to our rooms. "She requires rest, little sparrow, that is all," Madame would tell me, patting my head with a hand weighed down by rings. But her face was pinched with a worry she could not entirely conceal. The doctor came but once. He was a tall, grim man who carried a black leather bag that smelt of antiseptic and decay. He and Madame spoke in low, urgent whispers by the door whilst I sat on a stool by my mother's bed, holding her hand. It felt impossibly frail in mine. The only word I could make out from their grave conference was fever. It was such a small, simple word. Fevers came and went. Fevers were a temporary affliction. It did not sound like a word that could steal a person from the world. It did not sound like a final judgment. In the days that followed, I became her little nurse. I would dip a cloth in a basin of cool water and lay it across her brow. I read to her from our book of poems until my own voice grew hoarse, praying the familiar verses could be a lifeline. She was mostly quiet, her breathing shallow, but at times she would open her eyes and look at me, and in that gaze I saw a terror so profound it made my own fear feel small. She was afraid to leave me. That thought was more dreadful than any other. The end, when it came, was silent. I had fallen asleep in the armchair, the book open upon my lap. I awoke to a grey dawn and an unnerving stillness. The shallow rise and fall of her chest had ceased. The room was simply quiet. I knew with the chilling certainty only a child can possess that she was gone. The remainder of the morning was a blur. The other women, their faces stripped of paint and powder, marked instead with shock and pity. Madame Fleurette's arms about me, her rose perfume suffocating. And then the men who came not for pleasure, but for business, carrying a long canvas stretcher, which brought me back to the pavement. The cart was gone. The world was moving, and I was still. The hollow space in my chest was an ache so vast I could not breathe around it. I had not just lost my mother. I had lost the scent of lavender, the sound of my name spoken with tenderness, the feeling of her hand in mine. I had lost my entire world. A sharp, bony hand clamped down on my shoulder, and I flinched. I looked up into the face of a woman I scarcely recognized. She was thin and severe, dressed in a dull grey that seemed to absorb all the light around her. Her lips were a tight, unforgiving line. It was my Aunt Seneca, my mother's sister, a woman I had met on only 2 previous occasions. She looked at me not with pity, but with a sort of grim resignation, as if I were a parcel she was being forced to collect. "Come along, Penelope," she said, her voice as grey as her dress. "There is nothing for you here now." Her hand pulled me forward, and I finally moved, my feet stumbling to keep pace. I did not look back. There was nothing to look back upon. My life on Crimson Lane was over. My mother was gone. The silence she left behind was all that remained, and it was already beginning to fill with the sound of my aunt's quiet resentment. The dress was a torment. It was made of a coarse black wool that scratched at my neck and wrists, a punishment in textile form. My aunt, Mrs. Seneca Croft, pulled the fabric straight with a series of sharp, irritable tugs, her thin fingers digging into my shoulders. We were in her cramped, airless little bedchamber, a room that smelt of dust and dried lavender. It had been 3 days since she had collected me from the pavement on Crimson Lane. 3 days of a suffocating silence that was broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock and the sharp click of my aunt's sewing needles. This morning the silence felt different, heavier. It was the silence of performance. "Do try to stand still, Penelope," she said, her voice a low hiss. "One must show respect." Respect. The word felt alien. My heart was a hollow cavern of grief, a raw, empty space where my mother's voice used to be. I did not see how a scratchy dress and a still posture could possibly fill such a void. My uncle, Mr. Arthur Croft, stood awkwardly in the doorway. He was a small, kind man with worried eyes, a stark contrast to his severe wife. He offered me a hesitant smile, but my aunt shot him a look so cold it seemed to freeze the very air between them, and he retreated down the narrow staircase. The church was a great cold barn of a place, all grey stone and hard wooden pews that promised no comfort. Lights struggled through stained glass windows, painting bleeding colours on the dusty floor. My gaze was fixed upon the simple pine box that rested before the altar. It seemed impossibly small. How could my mother, with her sad smiles and her secret lullabies, be contained in something so plain, so final? A knot of tears formed in my throat, a hard, painful lump I could not swallow. I sat beside my aunt, her rigid posture a silent command for me to straighten my own spine. It was only when the vicar began to speak, his voice a droning monotone, that I dared to look at the other mourners. I expected to see the women from the house on Crimson Lane, their faces soft with genuine sorrow. But they were not there. Instead, the pews were filled almost exclusively with gentlemen, sombre, well-dressed men with stiff collars and grave expressions, their faces a gallery of uneasy duty. I recognised some of them. A man with a prominent signet ring who had often brought my mother violets. Another, older gentleman who always smelt of cloves. They were the shadows from our rooms, the quiet visitors, now brought into the stark light of day. They did not look at me. Their eyes were fixed on the coffin, on the vicar, on the hymn books clutched in their gloved hands, anywhere but at the small girl in the front pew. I saw their discomfort, the slight shifting in their seats, the way their wives, the few who were present, sat with a particular rigid distance from them. My aunt, however, acknowledged them. As they filed out of the pews to offer condolences, she would meet their gaze with a curt, meaningful nod, her expression a mask of perfect, respectable grief. It was a transaction. I did not understand its currency, but I could feel its weight. The air was thick with things unsaid, a shared hypocrisy that clung to the scent of wilting lilies and beeswax. My own simple sorrow felt out of place, a raw and clumsy thing amidst their careful theatre. It was then that a new feeling, cold and unsettling, began to creep in. It was the first prickle of shame. The gathering at my aunt's house was worse. Our small parlour, usually so still and dim, was now crowded with these same dark-suited men and now their wives. The women had arrived in a flurry of black silk and veiled hats, not for my mother, but for my aunt. They were here to perform the social ritual of paying respects to Mrs. Croft on the loss of her wayward sister. The room was suffocating, the air heavy with the scent of tea cakes and muted, morbid conversation. I was placed on a small stool near the window, an exhibit of orphanhood, and I was watched. The men continued to avoid my gaze, but the women looked. They assessed me from across the room, their eyes travelling over my ill-fitting dress, my too pale face. Their expressions were not of pity, but of a cold, detached curiosity, as if I were a strange new specimen pinned under glass. They whispered to one another behind their gloves, their words lost to me, but their meaning perfectly clear in their sharp, dismissive glances. I tried to make myself smaller, to fade into the grim floral wallpaper, but there was no escape. A tall woman with a face like a hawk's leaned towards her companion, her voice a low, carrying whisper I was not meant to hear, yet did. Truly a tragedy for poor Seneca, to be burdened with the courtesan's child. One can only pray the girl does not take after the mother. The courtesan's child. The words struck me with a physical force. They were not just words, they were a branding. They explained the unease of the men, the coldness of the women, the brittle performance of my aunt. My raw grief for my mother, my Ruth, did not vanish, but it was now tainted. Shame, thick and oily, coated everything, changing the very shape of my sorrow. I was no longer just a daughter who had lost her mother. I was the courtesan's daughter, a title bestowed upon me in a hushed whisper in a crowded room that cared nothing for my broken heart. When the last of the guests had finally departed, the house fell into a sudden, deep silence, broken only by the clatter of my aunt clearing away the teacups. She did not speak to me. She did not need to. Her disapproval was in the sharp snap of a saucer placed on a tray, in the stiff line of her back as she worked. I remained on my stool by the window, the dying afternoon light casting long shadows across the floor. The funeral was over. My mother was gone, and I was left with a new unwelcome inheritance, a name, a reputation, that was not my own, yet would follow me for the rest of my days. The days that followed the funeral bled into one another, a monotonous grey watercolour of silence and chores. My aunt's house was a narrow, grim little place, on a street where all the doors were painted the same shade of unforgiving brown. Inside, it was obsessively clean, a house scoured of any personality or comfort. There was no dust, but there was also no joy. The scent of my mother's lavender was replaced by the sharp, sterile smell of lye soap and boiled cabbage. Every object had its place. The stiff-backed chairs arranged just so, the doilies lying perfectly flat, the single joyless pot of ferns on the windowsill. It was the home of a woman who waged a constant, bitter war against disorder. I soon learned that I was the most disorderly thing to have ever entered it. My grief was a contraband emotion, something to be hidden away like a forbidden letter. I learned to cry only at night, my face buried in a thin, lumpy pillow, my sobs silent tremors in the dark. During the day, I moved through the house like a ghost, my footsteps light on the floorboards, my voice a quiet, yes, aunt, or no, aunt. Any sign of melancholy, a distant look, a moment of stillness was met with a sharp command to polish the brass or scrub the floors. My aunt, Mrs. Seneca Croft, did not believe in idleness, and she certainly did not believe in sorrow. It was, to her, a useless indulgence. The reckoning came a week after the funeral. The sky outside was the colour of slate, a steady, miserable drizzle weeping down the window panes. My aunt summoned me to the parlour, the room where the ladies had whispered my new name into existence. She sat in her favourite high-backed chair, her posture as rigid as a fence-post. Mr. Croft stood by the mantelpiece, his gaze fixed upon the empty hearth, his hands clasped nervously behind his back. "Penelope," my aunt began, her voice devoid of any warmth, "we must discuss your situation." She gestured to a small, plain lockbox on the table beside her. With a deliberate click, she opened it. It was almost empty, containing only a few dried flowers, a single pearl earring, and a handful of shillings. "This," she announced with grim satisfaction, "is the entirety of your mother's earthly possessions." She left nothing. No savings, no provision. Only the shame of her life, a debt which I have had to bear the cost of. She snapped the box shut. A decent burial was not inexpensive, and the continued cost of another mouth to feed is a considerable strain upon our modest household. I said nothing. My hands clenched in the lap of my scratchy black dress. I felt my uncle's gaze upon me, heavy with a pity he dared not speak aloud. "You are your mother's blood," my aunt continued, her eyes like chips of flint, "but you will not live her life of idleness under my roof. You will earn your keep. Our bakery requires another pair of hands. Your schooling is, of course, at an end. Your days will begin at 4 each morning. You will learn to knead dough, to fire the ovens, to serve customers. You will work, and you will be grateful for the charity I am showing you. Do you understand? Charity. The word was a slap. She was not offering me a home. She was offering me a sentence. I looked down at my hands, imagining them coated in flour, and felt a strange sense of resignation. This was my penance. This was the price for being Ruth's daughter. "Yes, aunt," I whispered. "I understand." Later that evening, as I sat alone in the cold scullery, my uncle appeared in the doorway. He glanced nervously back towards the parlour before stepping inside, closing the door softly behind him. In his hand, he held a warm, sweet-smelling biscuit from the bakery. He pressed it into my palm without a word, his fingers briefly closing over mine in a gesture of silent solidarity. "Your mother," he began, his voice a low, rough whisper. "She was not what they say. She had a good heart, a kind heart." His eyes were filled with an ancient, unspoken apology. He looked as much a prisoner in this house as I was. Footsteps sounded in the hall, and he started like a frightened rabbit, retreating from the scullery as silently as he had come. I ate the biscuit in the dark, and its sweetness was so profound, so at odds with the bitterness of my life, that it almost made me weep. The next morning, my aunt took me to the market. It was the first time I had been out in the town proper. The stares began almost immediately. The townsfolk, the women from the funeral, the shopkeepers, they all looked. I felt their gazes like insects crawling on my skin. A pair of women stopped their chatter to watch us pass, and I saw the words form on one of their lips, a perfect, silent articulation. The courtesan's daughter. I glanced at my aunt, expecting, I don't know what I expected. A defence, a sharp word to the gossips. Instead, her chin lifted, her expression settling into one of grim, public martyrdom. She wanted them to see. She wanted them to witness the pious Mrs. Croft, saddled with her sinful sister's unfortunate offspring. My shame was her badge of honour. It was then that I truly understood. I had not left my mother's life behind on Crimson Lane. I had carried it with me, packed away with my grief. It had followed me into this cold, respectable house, and it would follow me out into these grey, judgmental streets. It was not a whisper anymore. It was my name. The years that followed were not measured in birthdays or Christmases, but in the relentless rhythm of the bakery. Time was the pre-dawn chill of the scullery, the burn of the ovens against the winter air, the satisfying weight of a well-kneaded dough beneath my palms. It was the scent of hot cross-buns in the spring, of fruit loaves in the autumn, of spiced cakes as the year drew to its close. 11 years I spent in that cycle, and in that time, the small, grieving girl of 12 was slowly buried beneath layers of flour and quiet resignation. I grew taller, my body becoming strong from the labour, my hands chapped and calloused. I was 23 years of age, and the world I inhabited was confined to the space between the hot ovens and the front counter. My education had ended, as my aunt had decreed, but my mind did not cease its work. Whilst my hands were occupied with braiding loaves or scoring crusts, I would recite the verses my mother had taught me, their poetic cadence a secret music in the monotonous silence. I learned to observe the townsfolk who came for their daily bread, to read the stories in their faces, their hurried gossip, the small cruelties and kindnesses they exchanged over the counter. I became a creature of observation, a silent archivist of the lives that passed before me, whilst my own remained entirely still. My one connection to the world beyond the bakery door was Verda Mayhew. Before my life had been cleaved in two, we had been inseparable, our childhoods a shared story of scraped knees and whispered secrets in the schoolyard. I remembered the day it ended with a clarity that still ached. A fortnight after the funeral, she had found me in the market, her face pale, her eyes filled with tears. Her father, a prosperous draper, had forbidden her from ever speaking to me again. It would be ruinous for our family's reputation, she had whispered, her words choked with a shame that was not her own. Our friendship, however, did not die. It simply went into hiding. Once a week, on moonless nights, she would slip through the back gate of the bakery, her arms laden with books she had procured for me. We would sit in the cool, flower-dusted darkness, and she would tell me of dances and town events, of a life of possibility I could only imagine. Verda was my window to the world, my keeper of the girl I might have been. Her friendship was a balm, but its secrecy was a constant, painful reminder of the chasm that now lay between us. She carried the guilt of our deception, whilst I carried the lonely gratitude of a prisoner who is granted a few moments of sunlight each week. Day after day, I stood behind the counter, a ghost in a white apron. The whispers had not faded over the years. They had simply become a part of the bakery's atmosphere, as constant as the scent of yeast. The courtesan's daughter. The name clung to me. Some customers would look at me with a morbid pity, others with a sanctimonious scorn. I learned to erect a wall of polite indifference, to meet their gazes without seeing them, to serve them their bread, and take their coins without letting them touch any part of the girl who lived and breathed behind the counter. It was on a Tuesday in May that he first came into the shop himself. Lord Edward Kavanagh, the Duke of Ashworth. Of course, I knew of him. His estate lay a few miles from the town, a place of mythic grandeur I could not even picture. A servant from the hall would usually come for the Duke's order. 2 rustic loaves, always the same. But on this day, he came himself. The bell above the door chimed, and he entered, bringing with him a gust of cool spring air that seemed to clear the thick, flowery atmosphere for a moment. He was taller than I had imagined, dressed in a riding coat of dark, impeccable tweed. The idle chatter in the shop died away at his presence. He was not handsome in the way of storybook princes. His features were too severe for that. his expression too remote and shadowed. There was a cold stillness about him that commanded the space around him. He moved to the counter, his gaze sweeping over the loaves on display. 2 rustic loaves, he said. His voice was deep and quiet, devoid of the condescending warmth the gentry usually affected when speaking to shopkeepers. My hands trembled slightly as I wrapped the bread in brown paper. I could feel every eye in the shop on us, on this strange tableau of the Duke and the courtesan's daughter. I braced myself for the look I had seen 1,000 times, of pity, of curiosity, of judgment. But when his eyes, a startling, clear grey, met mine, they held none of it. They held nothing at all. He looked at me as one might look at any shop girl, a functional part of the transaction. He did not see my story. He did not see my mother's ghost hovering behind me. For a brief, startling moment, I was simply a girl selling bread. He placed the coins on the counter, his gloved fingers brushing mine for a fraction of a second. The touch was impersonal, accidental, yet it sent a strange jolt through me. He gave a curt nod, and then he was gone, the bell chiming his departure. The shop exhaled, the chatter resuming its usual hum. But for the rest of the day, I felt the phantom touch on my fingers. In a life where every look was a reminder of who I was, his utter indifference was the most profound kindness I had ever known. The bell above the shop door chimed on a Thursday afternoon, a sound so familiar it was usually just part of the air I breathed. But the silence that followed was different. It was a weighted, expectant hush that made me look up from the ledger where I was tallying the day's earnings. The figures swam before my eyes as I saw who had entered. Rosalind Thorne and Beatrice Finch stood just inside the doorway, 2 vibrant, exotic birds who had mistakenly flown into a dusty cage. Their dresses, a riot of silk and lace in the latest London fashion, seemed to suck all the colour from the muted, flower-dusted world of the bakery. They had been the architects of my misery in the schoolyard, their whispers the sharpest stones, their laughter the most painful blow. I had not spoken to either of them in over a decade. "Penelope," Rosalind said, her voice a confection of feigned surprise and delight. She glided towards the counter, leaving Beatrice to stand guard by the door. "We were just passing and thought, is that little Penelope Wren still toiling away in here? How wonderfully dedicated you are." "All this dust," Beatrice added from her post, wrinkling her nose as if the scent of honest bread was a personal affront. "It must be simply dreadful for your complexion." Their words were honey-laced poison. I felt a familiar coldness seep into my veins, the old practiced defensiveness. I straightened my spine and offered a polite, empty smile. "Miss Thorne, Miss Finch, what can I get for you today?" Rosalind waved a dismissive, gloved hand. "Oh, we're not here for bread, silly. We're here for you." She leaned forward, her expression shifting to one of theatrical pity. "Beatrice and I, and some of the other girls we were talking the other day, about you. We all felt so terribly, you see. About how things have been for you. We were horrid to you at school, truly, and we wish to make amends. It is time someone included you." I stared at her, my mind a whirl of suspicion. Their cruelty had been too deliberate, too artful, to be a simple childhood folly. This sudden benevolence felt like a poorly constructed stage play. And yet, a foolish, desperate part of me, a part I thought I had starved into submission years ago, wanted to believe her. "The annual All Hallows Masquerade is to be held at the Ainsworth estate in a fortnight," Rosalind continued, her eyes gleaming, "and we would be simply delighted if you would accompany us. As our guest, of course. An invitation to a ball." The words seemed to belong to another language, another life. Before I could formulate a refusal, she pressed on, leaning closer as if sharing a great secret. "Now, I know it can be terribly intimidating. All those people, the gowns. So, to make it all a bit of fun, a group of us have decided to go in a themed costume. Nothing grand, you understand. Something simple and amusing. A charming pastoral scene. We are all going dressed as dairymaids." A dairymaid. The image was absurd, but she described it with such earnest enthusiasm. A simple cotton dress, a white apron, a mob cap, perhaps a shepherd's crook for effect. "Won't it be a splendid joke? All of us together, she chirped. My mind screamed at me. It is a lie. It is a trap. I could see the ghost of the girl in the schoolyard crying in a corner after one of their pranks. But the image they painted was so intoxicating. The music, the lights, the laughter, to be a part of a group, even in a ridiculous costume. To have one single night, where I was not the ghost behind the counter, but a girl at a ball. One night of belonging. It was a thirst I had forgotten I had, and they had just offered me a glass of cool, clear water, or what looked like it. I would be honoured, I heard myself say, the words feeling clumsy and foreign on my tongue. Hope, I discovered, was a far more dangerous thing than despair. In the days that followed, that fragile hope became a secret, frantic obsession. I told no one. Not even Verda. I was ashamed of my own gullibility. And I could not bear her gentle pity if, when, it all proved to be a lie. Every spare halfpenny I had ever saved, every coin I could skim from my meagre allowance without my aunt noticing, was gathered into a small cloth bag. I bought cheap cotton and muslin from a stall at the far end of the market, my cheeks burning as I paid. My nights were transformed. After the house was dark and silent, I would work in my small, cold attic room by the light of a single sputtering candle. My fingers, clumsy from years of kneading dough, fumbled with the delicate needle and thread. I stitched my hope and my desperation into that simple costume, the soft white fabric a stark contrast to my rough, flower-ground hands. The costume became my prayer, my foolish wager against a decade of evidence. The night of the ball arrived on a wave of cold, crisp air. I presented myself in the parlour, the finished costume on, my heart hammering against my ribs. I expected my aunt to unleash a tirade about my foolishness, about wasting time and money on such absurd notions. She looked me up and down, her face impassive. She circled me once, her eyes narrowed on the stitching. I braced myself. "The hem is crooked," she said flatly. "Fix it." She turned to leave the room, then stopped at the door, her back still to me. "Go, child," she said, her voice a low, unreadable murmur. "Let them see you are more than a baker's girl." Her words were not kind, not truly. They were a dismissal, perhaps even a challenge, but I clung to them as if they were a blessing. Her strange, grudging approval was the final push I needed. It felt like a sign. I did not understand then that a hand at your back can be pushing you towards a cliff just as easily as it can be pushing you towards a brighter future. The Ainsworth estate was not a house, it was a galaxy. A constellation of impossibly bright windows burned against the black velvet of the night, spilling music and golden light onto sprawling manicured lawns. I had walked the last mile from where the hired cart had dropped me, and my simple shoes were damp with dew, the hem of my costume collecting bits of grass. I felt small and foolish before I even reached the door, clutching my shepherd's crook like a talisman against the overwhelming grandeur. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to flee into the familiar shadows, but the memory of my aunt's grudging approval pushed me forward. Let them see you are more than a baker's girl. A footman in livery opened the great oak doors, his face a mask of polite indifference that barely concealed a flicker of surprise as his eyes took in my attire. I murmured the name Miss Thorne, as Rosalind had instructed, and he nodded, gesturing me towards a magnificent arching doorway from which the music swelled. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I took a deep, steadying breath, smoothed down my white apron, and stepped through. I did not step into a party. I stepped into a different world. The ballroom was a masterpiece of light and sound, a cavern of glittering crystal and polished marble that reflected 100 dancing couples. A vast chandelier, dripping with what seemed like 1,000 candles, cast a brilliant, merciless glow over everything. The air was warm and thick with the scent of hothouse flowers, expensive perfume, and champagne. Women in gowns of shimmering satin and jewel-toned velvet swirled past, their laughter like the chiming of tiny bells, their necks and wrists ablaze with diamonds. Men in sharp black tailcoats guided them, their faces handsome and assured. It was a perfect, living portrait of elegance. And into this portrait walked a dairymaid. I took 3 steps onto the polished floor before the music seemed to falter. A ripple went through the crowd, a subtle shift in the current of the room. The conversations nearest to me dipped, the dancing slowed, and then came the looks, 100 pairs of eyes, all turning towards me. There was confusion first, then a dawning collective amusement. A titter of laughter from a nearby group of young ladies was quickly stifled behind a fan, but the sound was as loud as a gunshot in the suddenly quiet room. My blood ran cold. My mind, a frantic, cornered thing, scrambled for an explanation. I was in the wrong room. This was not the masquerade. But no. The guests wore small, elegant masks of silk and lace held on delicate sticks. This was the place. These were the people. And I was the joke. The simple, charming costume I had laboured over for nights on end was, in this context, a mark of idiocy. The cotton was coarse, the stitching clumsy. My mob cap felt like a jester's hat, my shepherd's crook a fool's sceptre. The heat of 1,000 blushes rose from my neck to my hairline, a painful, scalding wave of shame. My breath caught in my throat. I could not move. I could only stand there, pinned by their stares. My foolish hope dying a slow, excruciating death under the light of 1,000 candles. My eyes scanned the sea of mocking faces, searching desperately for Rosalind, for Beatrice, for the other dairymaids who were supposed to be my safe harbour. And then I saw them. They were holding court near the orchestra, surrounded by a circle of admiring young men. Rosalind was a vision in a gown of emerald silk that shimmered like a serpent's skin. Beatrice was beside her, radiant in deep crimson. They were not dairymaids. They were queens. Rosalind's eyes met mine across the glittering expanse. There was no pity in them. There was only the pure, triumphant gleam of a predator who has watched its prey walk directly into the snare. She smiled, a slow, deliberate curving of her perfect lips, and lifted her champagne glass in a small, mocking toast. Just to me. It was then that the last of my foolish hope shattered. It was a game. All of it. A meticulously planned, exquisitely cruel game, and I was the punchline. As my gaze darted away from hers, desperate for any escape, it landed on a figure standing alone near the French doors. He was not laughing. His face was a thundercloud of cold disapproval. His grey eyes narrowed not at the crowd, but directly at me. It was the Duke, Lord Edward Cavanaugh. His witnessing of my utter debasement was the final, twisting turn of the knife. Panic, pure and absolute, finally broke my paralysis. I had to get out. I turned, stumbling blind to everything but the exit. I did not see the footman. I only felt the impact, a clumsy collision of bodies followed by an almighty crash. A massive, ornate punch bowl flew from his hands, shattering on the marble floor in a spectacular explosion of glass and crimson liquid. A woman shrieked as the punch splashed across the hem of her white gown. The room, which had been filled with laughter, was now filled with gasps of shock and outrage. But in that chaos, I found my escape, mortified beyond the limits of endurance, dripping with punch and shame. I did not stop to apologize. I scrambled to my feet and bolted. I ran through the stunned crowd, past the horrified faces and the ruined gowns, out of the golden light of the ballroom, and into the cold, clean darkness of the night. I did not run on the drive. I ran for the trees, plunging from the manicured lawns into the wild, untamed darkness of the woods. The music and laughter from the ballroom were swallowed by the sudden thick silence of the ancient oaks. But I could still hear them in my mind, a phantom chorus of mockery that spurred me on. Panic was a wild creature in my chest, clawing at my lungs. I ran blindly, my breath coming in ragged, tearing sobs the flimsy shepherd's crook abandoned somewhere in the undergrowth. Branches, like skeletal fingers, snagged at my ridiculous costume, ripping the cheap cotton and scratching my skin. The shame was a physical thing, a pack of hounds nipping at my heels, and I could not outrun it. I ran until my legs gave way, until the fire in my lungs burned hotter than the humiliation in my cheeks. I collapsed at the base of a great tree, my body shaking uncontrollably, the torn remnants of my dairymaid apron stained with punch and dirt. The cold seeped in then, a deep, penetrating chill that found its way through the thin fabric and settled in my bones. I was lost, foolish, and utterly, hopelessly alone. After a time that could have been minutes or an hour, the violent shaking subsided into a dull, exhausted tremor. I forced myself to my feet. To remain here was impossible. I began to walk, my only direction being away from the faint, distant glow of the Ainsworth estate. The woods were a disorienting maze, a place of menacing shadows and strange, nocturnal sounds. A snapping twig to my left sent a fresh spike of terror through me, the fear of pursuit or worse, giving my weary legs new purpose. I stumbled on, pushing through tangled bushes and over gnarled roots until I broke free of the tree line and found myself at the edge of another long, winding drive. In the distance, silhouetted against the moonlit clouds, stood another great house. My heart sank with a sickening lurch. Had I, in my blind panic, run in a great foolish circle only to end up back where I started? I stared at the dark mass of the building, my spirit failing. But as my eyes adjusted, I saw that it was different. Where the Ainsworth estate had been a blaze of light and life, this house was dark, silent and severe. It was a fortress of stone and shadow, with a single lonely light burning in a lower window. It did not look welcoming, but it looked quiet. It looked like a place where no one was laughing. The sound of a fox crying out in the woods behind me made my decision. I ran, my feet crunching on the gravel of the drive, my gaze fixed on that solitary point of light, as if it were a lighthouse in a storm. I did not know whose house it was. I knew only that it was not the one I had just fled. I reached the grand entrance, my breath misting in the cold air. The towering oak doors were as intimidating as any I had ever seen. I was about to turn away, to seek shelter in the stables or some other outbuilding, when I noticed that one of the doors was not quite shut. It was ajar by the barest of inches, a sliver of deeper blackness against the night. It was as if someone had just entered and neglected to secure the latch. It was an invitation, without a second thought, driven by cold and a desperate primal need for sanctuary. I slipped inside. The silence within was absolute. It was a deep, resonant silence, broken only by the slow, funereal tick-tock of a grandfather clock somewhere in the cavernous darkness. The air was still and cool, smelling of beeswax and old stone. I stood frozen in the vast entry hall, letting my eyes adjust. Moonlight filtered through a high arched window, illuminating a marble floor and the ghostly shapes of furniture. Hearing a faint, distant sound, a closing door, a footstep, my frantic heart leapt into my throat. I had to hide. My eyes darted around the hall and settled on the most obvious refuge. A large, heavy table in the centre of the space, draped in a thick dark velvet cloth that pooled on the floor. I dove for it, scrambling underneath and pulling the heavy fabric straight, my body curling into a tight ball in the dusty darkness. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps grew closer, slow and measured. A pair of impeccably polished black shoes appeared at the edge of the tablecloth and stopped. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying for invisibility. A long moment passed. Then the velvet cloth was lifted. My terrified gaze met the pale, impassive eyes of a butler. He was ancient, thin as a rail, his face a road map of weary disapproval. There was no shock in his expression, no alarm. Only the profound, tired exasperation of a man who has seen everything and is impressed by nothing. He did not speak. He simply stood, holding the cloth aloft, letting the cold air wash over me. A minute later, the great oak door opened again, and a gust of wind swept into the hall. "Problems, Jennings?" a deep, tired voice asked. "A small one, Your Grace," the butler replied, his voice as dry as autumn leaves. He let the tablecloth fall, but gestured towards it. Heavy footsteps approached. The velvet was lifted once more, and I found myself staring up into the severe, shadowed face of Lord Edward Cavanaugh, the Duke. He crouched down, the moonlight from the window catching the sharp line of his jaw. A flicker of recognition passed through his grey eyes, but it was followed not by anger or surprise, but by a look of immense, soul-deep exhaustion. He sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of the entire evening. "Miss Dairymaid, I presume," he said, his voice laced with a dry, tired irony that was somehow worse than shouting. "I am a very weary man, and you are underneath my table. This is not, I confess, how I envisioned my evening concluding. Do you plan on remaining there for the duration of the night?" His voice, edged with that dry, weary irony, was more unnerving than any shout would have been. I remained frozen in the dusty darkness beneath the table, my shame a physical cloak, heavier than the velvet one that concealed me. To emerge now, into the moonlight of the foyer, into the gaze of the man who had witnessed my utter ruin, seemed an impossible feat. I wished the floor would simply swallow me whole. "I will not," I whispered, my voice a broken, childish thing. The Duke did not sigh again. He did not grow angry. He simply moved, the sound of his boots echoing on the marble. I heard the creak of a nearby chair as he sat down. "Very well," he said into the silence, "we shall wait. My butler, Jennings, is an elderly man. I am certain he will be thrilled to stand here as a sentry all night. I myself had plans to retire, but I am a man of great patience. However, you must concede the impracticality of your position. Thirst will eventually drive you out, if not the morning chill. It would be far more efficient for all parties if you would simply emerge now, and we can address this situation like two rational adults." His calm, infuriating logic was a solvent, dissolving my panicked hysteria and leaving behind only the cold, hard absurdity of it all. A dairymaid hiding under a duke's table at midnight. The sheer folly of it was a second, quieter humiliation. With a trembling breath, I pushed aside the heavy velvet and crawled out. I rose to my feet on shaky legs, a pathetic spectacle in my torn, punch-stained costume. I could not meet his eyes. I fixed my gaze on a dark portrait on the wall, my entire being consumed with a wish to become invisible. He observed me for a long moment, and I could feel his analytical gaze upon me. There was no pity in it, nor was there contempt. It was the detached curiosity of a naturalist examining a strange, bedraggled specimen. "Taking you home now, in this state and at this hour, would only compound the scandal," he said finally, his tone decisive. "You will remain here for the night." He turned to his butler. "Jennings, have Mrs. Gable prepare the blue guest chamber, and find something simple for her to wear." He led me up a grand, sweeping staircase and down a long, silent corridor. The house was a place of shadows and order, the air still and cold. He stopped before a door and opened it, revealing a small, Spartan but impeccably clean room. "We shall speak in the morning," he said, his expression unreadable in the dim light. Most things seem less calamitous in the light of day. He gave a curt nod and was gone, the sound of his footsteps receding down the hall, leaving me alone in the deafening silence of his home. The morning brought a harsh, grey light that only magnified the calamity. I was sent home in a plain, unmarked carriage, the journey a ride of pure dread. My aunt's reaction was precisely as I had feared. Her initial fury at my absence curdled into a sharp, cruel laugh as I explained the trick. "Just like your mother," she hissed, her eyes gleaming with vindication. "You have not only ruined yourself, you have brought shame upon this house." The 3 days that followed were a living torment. The gossip from the ball had spread through the town like the plague. Our bakery, once a place of steady custom, became a theatre for my humiliation. Women who had bought bread from me for years now peered through the window to get a look at the town's new fool, whispering behind their hands before walking on. On the second day, Rosalind Thorne and Beatrice Finch had the audacity to stop by, their faces masks of false concern. "Dearest Penelope," Rosalind said, her voice loud enough for the 2 customers present to hear. "We were so terribly worried. To run off and cause such a scene. Are you quite well?" Their visit was a victory lap, a final turn of the knife. After they left, my aunt's silence was more damning than any tirade. On the 4th day, the Duke's formal carriage appeared at our door. Its presence on our humble street was like an explosion of silence. My aunt, flustered and awed, showed him into our grim parlour. Lord Edward Kavanagh stood by the window, a figure of immense, formidable power. He turned to face us, his expression grave. "Mrs. Croft," he began, his grey eyes moving from her to me, "I will not waste your time. I have come to address the situation regarding your niece." He paused, his gaze direct and unflinching. "I am aware that the solution I am about to propose is unorthodox, but we find ourselves in an extraordinary and deeply unjust circumstance," he continued, his voice low but carrying an immense weight. "The events of the Ainsworth ball were a disgusting spectacle. However, my decision is not based on that night alone. For some time now, during my visits to your bakery, I have observed the manner in which your niece is treated by the people of this town. I have witnessed the whispers, the scorn. I was present on an occasion when a customer sought to humiliate her by loudly referencing her parentage. What struck me was not the cruelty. I have come to expect that from society. But Miss Wren's response. She did not weep. She did not flinch. She met the insult with a quiet and unbreakable dignity. It was memorable. My head shot up. I stared at him, my heart beginning a slow, heavy thud. He remembered that. "What I saw at the ball, therefore, was not an isolated prank," he went on, his voice hardening. "It was the culmination of years of quiet persecution. I am not a man who abides cruelty, Mrs. Croft. I find it a contemptible brand of injustice to punish an innocent for the perceived sins of a parent. To see a young woman of character and fortitude systematically crushed for sport is an offence I am not inclined to ignore." My aunt stood speechless, her face pale. "Your niece's reputation," the Duke stated, turning his full attention to me, "has been destroyed by the malicious actions of others. A reputation once shattered cannot be repaired. It can only be replaced by a name so powerful it silences all gossip." He took a breath. "I find myself in need of a duchess to fend off the tiresome matchmaking of the season. You, Miss Wren, for the reasons I have just stated, your discretion, your fortitude, and your lack of a meddling family, are a uniquely suitable candidate. Therefore, I propose a marriage of convenience. We shall be married for a period of 1 year. You will have my name and my protection. At the end of the term, we shall arrange a quiet, legal separation. At that time, a marriage settlement of a considerable sum will be transferred into your name, ensuring your financial independence for the rest of your days. It is a business arrangement. There will be no other expectations between us." He had laid it all out. A contract, a trade. Not an act of pity, but a calculated solution to an injustice he found personally offensive. He had chosen me not because I was ruined, but because he believed I was strong. I looked at my aunt's stunned, calculating face, then thought of the whispers, the laughter, the life of shame that stretched before me. He was offering me a shield, a gilded cage, to be sure, but one built on a foundation of respect I had never known. With a trembling that I could not control, I gave a single, small nod. "I accept," I whispered. Our wedding was not a ceremony. It was a transaction signed in a cold, empty church. The only witnesses were the Duke's aging solicitor and my uncle, Mr. Arthur Croft, who looked profoundly uncomfortable in his Sunday best. My aunt refused to attend. To be seen at such a hasty, scandalous wedding would be, she had declared, an intolerable stain on her own reputation. I stood beside the Duke at the altar, a stranger in a borrowed dress of pale blue silk, and listened to the hollow echo of the vicar's words. I did not feel like a bride. I felt like a parcel being transferred from one owner to another, my name and my future signed away with a scratch of ink in a dusty ledger. When we returned to the bakery to collect my things, my aunt did not look at me. She simply pointed to the single, small trunk at the foot of the stairs which contained all my worldly possessions. My uncle pressed a worn shilling into my hand, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "Be well, child," he whispered, before his wife called his name in a tone that cracked like a whip. And that was it. I walked out of the narrow, grim little house and into the Duke's grand carriage, leaving 11 years of my life behind, as if it were nothing more than a bad dream. Ashworth Manor did not rise from the landscape. It commanded it. It was a vast, severe edifice of grey stone, its many windows like watchful eyes staring out over 1,000 acres of ancient parkland. As the carriage crunched to a halt on the gravel drive, the great oak doors swung open. The staff was assembled in the grand foyer. A silent, curious regiment of maids, footmen and valets, all under the command of the ancient butler Jennings, and a stern-faced housekeeper with hair pulled into a ruthlessly tight bun. She was introduced as Mrs. Gable. "Your Grace," Jennings said, bowing to the Duke. Then his pale, dispassionate eyes turned to me. "Your Grace." The title felt like a costume, another ill-fitting garment I was being forced to wear. The staff stared, their faces a mixture of deference, suspicion, and undisguised curiosity. I was the talk of the town, the baker's girl, the courtesan's daughter who had somehow ensnared the untouchable Duke. I could feel their assessment, their judgment, and I instinctively pulled the walls of my quiet indifference up around me. I was shown not to a room, but to a suite of rooms. A bedchamber, a sitting room, and a dressing room, all larger than the entire ground floor of my aunt's house. The furniture was exquisite, the fabrics were rich, but it was all cold, opulent, and impersonal. My small trunk looked pathetic and lost in the corner of the vast dressing room. I soon discovered that the Duke's own apartments were in the opposite wing of the house. The physical distance between us was a clear, unspoken reinforcement of the terms of our arrangement. I had not been brought here to be a wife. I had been brought here to be a duchess, and the two, it seemed, were entirely different things. The days that followed were defined by a new kind of loneliness. It was a grand, echoing loneliness, far different from the cramped, resentful silence of my aunt's house. I was a ghost in a palace, drifting through rooms of breathtaking beauty, my footsteps silent on priceless carpets. Our lives quickly settled into a routine of polite restraint. We would take breakfast together in a vast dining room, separated by an ocean of polished mahogany. The silence was broken only by the clink of silverware against porcelain. He would read his letters, and I would stare out the window at the endless green lawns, my heart aching with a strange, hollow feeling. The library became our shared sanctuary, the only place where the silence felt comfortable rather than strained. It was a magnificent 2-story room, smelling of old leather and beeswax, its walls lined with thousands of books. He would spend his evenings at a large desk at one end, buried in the endless paperwork of his estate, his face etched with a familiar, weary concentration. I would curl up in a worn armchair by the great stone hearth, finally with access to all the words and worlds I had ever craved. We rarely spoke, but in that shared quiet, we began to observe. I noticed the way he would rub the back of his neck when a line in a ledger displeased him, the small, almost imperceptible sigh he would release when he finally put his pen down for the night. And he, I sensed, noticed me. I would sometimes look up from my book and find his grey eyes upon me, his expression unreadable before he would quickly return to his work. From the maids who brought my morning tea, I began to learn of my husband's reputation. They spoke in hushed, reverent whispers of his coldness, his solitary nature. He was the beast of Ashworth, they said, a man whose heart was as cold and hard as the stone of his house. They spoke of the eligible young ladies of the aristocracy who had tried and failed to capture his interest, all of them dismissed with a cutting word or a look of icy indifference. "No woman has ever warmed his bed, Your Grace," one young maid confided, her eyes wide. "Nor ever will, they say." I filed these stories away, and they served as a constant reminder of the chasm between us, reinforcing my resolve to remain a ghost in his life, to expect nothing. One evening, I fell asleep by the fire, a book of poetry resting open on my lap. I woke some time later with a start, the fire having burned down to glowing embers, a deep chill in the air. A heavy woolen blanket was draped over my shoulders and tucked around me. The library was empty. The Duke was gone. I sat there for a long time, clutching the rough wool, a strange warmth spreading through my chest that had nothing to do with the blanket. The following night, seeing him once again engrossed in his work, forgoing dinner entirely, I took a small liberty. I asked Mrs. Gable to prepare a tray with sandwiches and a pot of fresh tea. I carried it into the library myself and placed it on a small table beside his desk. I did not say a word. I simply set it down and retreated to my chair, hiding behind the pages of my book. I watched from the corner of my eye as he paused, looking at the tray in surprise. He hesitated for a moment, then gave a single, almost imperceptible nod in my direction. When I went up to bed later that night, the tray was empty. Our first test as a married couple came a week later, when the local vicar and his wife came to pay their respects. They were a plump, self-satisfied pair, their conversation a thinly veiled interrogation about my past. "Such a whirlwind, romance," the vicar's wife chirped, her eyes sharp and probing. "One wonders how you ever had the chance to meet his grace, coming from such a humble background." I froze, the familiar shame rising in my throat. But before I could stammer a reply, the Duke spoke, his voice cool and smooth as polished steel. "My wife and I share a great love of literature," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I was fortunate enough to make her acquaintance through our mutual passion. I find a keen intellect to be a most attractive quality." He steered the rest of the conversation to the topic of church repairs, his authority an unbreachable wall. The vicar and his wife left soon after, their curiosity thwarted. The Duke said nothing of the incident after they were gone, but as he passed my chair on his way to his study, he paused. "You have a smudge of ink on your cheek, Your Grace," he said quietly. It was not an apology. It was not a word of comfort. But it was the first time I had ever felt the true, unyielding power of his name, and what it meant to be protected by it. In the quiet of the library that night, I realized with a startling clarity that for the first time in my life, I was not entirely alone. The autumn leaves bled their colours and fell, and the world outside Ashworth Manor grew quiet and withdrawn, settling in for the long sleep of winter. Inside, a different kind of quiet settled between the Duke and me. The tense, strained silence of our first weeks together gradually softened, evolving into something less like an absence of sound and more like a shared, comfortable space. The library remained our sanctuary. He would work for hours under the gas lamp, the scratch of his pen the only sound, while I sat by the fire, lost in the pages of some forgotten poet. I grew accustomed to the rhythm of his presence, the way he would lean back in his chair when deep in thought, the low murmur of his voice when his butler Jennings came to consult with him. The vast, intimidating house began to feel, if not like a home, then at least like a familiar, peaceful harbour. Winter arrived in earnest, blanketing the estate in a thick shroud of white. The world became a place of stark, beautiful monochrome, and our lives became even more confined to the walls of the manor. It was on a crisp, cold morning, the sun glinting off the frost on the window panes, that he broke our established ritual. "Do you ride, Your Grace?" he asked, his voice cutting through the quiet of the library. I looked up from my book, startled. It was the first direct, personal question he had ever asked me. "No, Your Grace," I admitted, my cheeks warming slightly. "I have never had the opportunity." He looked at me for a long moment, his grey eyes analytical. "That is an oversight we must correct," he said, his tone decisive. "A duchess must be able to ride. I will teach you myself. Be ready in an hour." The stables were a world away from the silent library, full of the warm, sweet smell of hay and horsehide. He had a gentle, aging mare named Bessie saddled for me. Despite the horse's placid nature, my heart hammered against my ribs. The Duke was unexpectedly patient, his voice calm and steady, as he explained how to hold the reins, how to sit. But the moment I was lifted onto the saddle, a clumsy, terrified passenger, all instruction fled my mind. I was stiff with fear, and after a few wobbly steps I lost my balance entirely, sliding ungracefully from the horse's back into a soft, deep pile of hay. I lay there, mortified, my ridiculous riding habit askew, expecting a sigh of exasperation or a cold dismissal. Instead, I heard a sound I had never heard before. A laugh. It was not a polite chuckle, but a deep, genuine laugh that seemed to startle even him. It transformed his severe face completely, and as I looked up at him, A great, unexpected bubble of mirth rose up inside me, and I began to laugh too. A breathless, helpless laughter that shook my entire body. That shared laugh was a key turning a lock. The formal walls between us did not so much crumble as simply dissolve. He began to invite me on his daily walks around the estate, his boots crunching beside mine on the frosted ground. He was no longer just the silent duke in his study. He was Edward, the master of his land. He pointed out the ancient oaks that needed to be felled, explained the concerns of his tenant farmers, and spoke of his plans for the spring planting. He spoke to me as an equal, his respect for my mind a quiet, steady gift. I, in turn, began to see the immense weight of the duty he carried. I consciously labelled our new, easy companionship as a safe, platonic friendship. It felt, I told myself firmly, as though I had found the brother I never had. It was a safe, comfortable box to put him in, one that did not threaten the fragile peace I had found. It was in the depths of this comfortable winter that he announced he had to leave. "Parliament is in session," he said one evening in the library. "I must be in London for 3 weeks." A sudden, sharp pang of loss shot through me, so unexpected it stole my breath. 3 weeks. The library without him. The house without his quiet, steadying presence. The thought was unbearable. "When will you leave?" I asked, my voice smaller than I intended. "On the morning train," he said, his eyes on his papers. He left on a bleak, frozen morning. The silence he left behind was not the comfortable quiet I had grown used to. It was a hollow, aching void. That night, unable to bear the emptiness of the library, I retreated to my sitting room, took out a fresh sheet of paper, and dipped my pen in the ink. From the unsent letters of Penelope, Duchess of Ashworth, Day 1, my dearest Edward. How foolish it is to be writing this. You will, of course, never see it. But the silence in the house tonight is so profound I felt I must fill it with something. The library feels twice as large now that you are not in it. I find the silence is no longer a comfortable one, but an empty one. I hope your journey was without incident. Day 7. Another week has passed. I have been spending my time in the gardens speaking with the head gardener about the spring planting. He has ideas for the rose garden, and I find I have ideas of my own. It is strange to be planning for a spring I am not certain I will see here. I had a fire lit in the library this evening, but the house is colder when you are not here. Day 20. You are to return tomorrow. I feel a nervousness I cannot explain, like a girl awaiting a visitor she has no right to expect. This has been a silly exercise, writing these letters to no one, a way to feel less alone. But because I know you will never read this, I can be honest. I can say the things a duchess in a business arrangement should never even think. I believe, Edward, that I am falling... No, I cannot even write the word. How silly of me. How utterly, foolishly silly. His return from London was a quiet disruption, a subtle shift in the gravitational pull of the house. I was in the main hall arranging some winter roses in a vase when the doors opened and he entered, bringing with him the chill of the outside world. Our eyes met across the expanse of marble, and my heart gave a painful, joyous lurch. I had missed him with an intensity that had frightened me, and now, seeing him again, so solid and real, I had to physically clench my hands to keep from showing the foolish, unseemly depth of my relief. The comfortable, easy friendship we had built before his departure resumed, but for me, everything had changed. Our walks on the frosted grounds, our quiet evenings in the library, they were all now coloured by the secret I kept locked away in my writing desk. I was hyper-aware of his presence, of the sound of his voice, of the rare moments his grey eyes would soften with a hint of a smile. I was living a double life. On the outside, the quiet, agreeable duchess in her marriage of convenience. On the inside, a girl foolishly, hopelessly in love. This fragile new world I was building for myself came crashing down the following week, with the arrival of Lady Annalise. She was his cousin, as I would later learn, but at that moment, all I saw was a woman of breathtaking elegance, dressed in a travelling suit of deep blue velvet that made my simple day dress look like a servant's frock. She moved with an easy, aristocratic confidence I could never possess, and she spoke to Edward with a familiar, teasing affection that made my own formal interactions with him seem pathetic. I was in the doorway of the drawing room, about to ask if they required tea, when I saw them. They were standing by the large bay window, their heads close together in an intense, private conversation. As I watched, my feet frozen to the spot, he reached out and placed a hand on her arm, his expression one of grave, tender concern. In that instant, the fragile hope I had been nurturing withered and died. The whispers from the maids, the rumours of his attachments, my own deepest insecurities, they all coalesced into a single, ugly truth. This was a woman from his world. This was the kind of woman a duke was meant to be with. Beautiful, confident, one of his own. I was a temporary placeholder, an amusing diversion, a business arrangement. The warmth I had felt from him was not for me. It was simply the nature of a kind man. My heart, which had been so full only moments before, felt like a cold, heavy stone in my chest. I retreated up the stairs as silently as a ghost. That evening, a violent storm broke. It threw handfuls of rain against the great windows and sent the ancient oaks groaning in protest. The sky was bruised and dark, a perfect mirror for the turmoil in my own soul. I did not go to the library. I remained in my sitting room, staring into the fire, my posture as rigid and cold as my resolve to never again be so foolish. I heard the door open behind me. "Are you unwell, Your Grace?" he asked. "I am perfectly well," I replied, not turning, my voice tight. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. His frustration was a palpable thing. "Have I done something to displease you, Penelope?" He used my given name, and the intimacy of it was like a hot poker against my frozen heart. "You have done nothing, Your Grace," I said. My voice clipped. "You must not let my presence interfere with your prior attachments." There was a long pause. A deafening crack of thunder shook the house, and the lamps flickered and died, plunging the room into the primal light of the fire. "My prior attachments?" he repeated, his voice closer now, full of a strange disbelief. "You are referring, I presume, to Lady Annalise?" I said nothing, my silence a bitter accusation. "Lady Annalise is my cousin," he said, his voice flat and weary. "Her husband died a month ago, leaving her with 2 small children and a mountain of debt. I was offering her the counsel of my solicitor. That is the extent of our attachment." I felt a flush of shame creep up my neck. I had been so quick to believe the worst. He took a step closer, his shadow merging with mine in the firelight. "You have been listening to gossip. They call me a rake, a beast. Is that what you believe?" He sounded not angry, but profoundly tired. He let out a breath, a sound that was almost a confession. "The truth, madam, is that I have always been wary of marriage, of the expectations, of failing to be what a husband ought to be." He looked into the fire, his profile etched by the flames. "Of disappointing." The confession hung in the air between us, as raw and vulnerable as an open wound. The cold, confident Duke, the beast of Ashworth, was afraid of not being enough. It was a fear I knew intimately. The great wall of his title crumbled, and I saw only the man, Edward, as lonely and as guarded as myself. "Perhaps," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "it is not a test one can fail." He turned then, and truly looked at me, his grey eyes filled with a raw, startling emotion. The air between us grew thick, charged with all the things we had never said. He closed the small distance between us and lifted a hand to my face, his thumb gently grazing my cheek. The touch was an electric jolt of warmth. He leaned in, his gaze fixed on my lips, and I wanted him to kiss me with a desperation that terrified me. But a lifetime of shame is a powerful enemy. The whisper, the courtesan's child, screamed in my mind. I was not worthy of this. In a moment of pure, ingrained panic, I turned my head. His lips brushed against my cheek, a soft, warm pressure that was over as soon as it began. The moment was broken. He pulled back as if burned, his expression shuddering, the walls rising once more. The vulnerable man was gone, and the Duke was back in his place. "My apologies, Your Grace," he said, his voice formal and distant. He gave a stiff, formal bow and retreated from the room, leaving me trembling by the fire, the storm outside a pale echo of the one that had just broken inside the house. The aftermath of the storm was a profound and unnerving silence. The comfortable quiet we had built between us was gone, shattered by that one moment of raw vulnerability and retreat. In its place, a wall of strained, awkward formality rose, higher and colder than before. We became ghosts to each other once more, haunting opposite ends of the vast, silent house. Breakfast was an exercise in mutual evasion, our gazes fixed firmly on our plates. The library, once our shared sanctuary, was abandoned. I could not bring myself to enter it. So charged was it, with the memory of his confession and my failure. And he, it seemed, felt the same. I spent my days in the gardens, the winter chill a welcome distraction from the turmoil in my heart. I replayed the moment by the fire 1,000 times in my mind. He had offered me a glimpse of the man behind the title, a man who was lonely and afraid. And I, in my own cowardice, had slammed the door in his face. The shame of my reaction was a constant, bitter companion. I had spent my life building walls to protect myself, and I now found myself a prisoner behind them, unable to reach for the one person who had ever made me feel safe. A week after the storm, he sought me out in the morning parlour. He stood in the doorway, a formal, distant figure. "I find I must travel to London," he said, his voice devoid of all emotion. "Parliamentary matters require my attention. I shall be gone a fortnight." It was not a discussion. It was a pronouncement. It was also an escape. He was fleeing from the suffocating tension between us, and I could not blame him. A part of me was even relieved. But the larger part, the part that had foolishly begun to love him, felt a pain so sharp it was difficult to breathe. "I see," I said, my voice a quiet, brittle thing. "I wish you a safe journey, Your Grace." Our goodbye at the grand entrance the next morning was a portrait of cold propriety. He, formal in his travelling coat, I, the perfect, emotionless Duchess. We exchanged polite, meaningless words while the footman loaded his luggage. There was no warmth, no echo of the friendship we had so briefly shared. As his carriage pulled away down the long drive, I felt as if the last bit of warmth in the world was disappearing with it. That night, the oppressive silence of the manor became my tormentor. Every tick of the clock, every creak of the floorboards echoed the emptiness he had left behind. I could not bear it. I went to my writing desk, the place where I had allowed myself to be honest, and took out my pen. The words came in a desperate, painful flood. From the unsent letters of Penelope, Duchess of Ashworth. Day 1. Edward, you are gone, and I am a coward. That is the beginning and the end of it. The house is so still I can hear my own heart breaking. You showed me a glimpse of your true self, and I turned away. Please know, wherever you are, it was not you I was running from. It was myself. It was the girl who was told she was worthless, the girl who does not believe she is deserving of a moment of genuine tenderness. She is a powerful ghost, and I am afraid I may never be free of her. Day 4. I walked by the stables today. Bessie, the old mare, looked over her stall at me, and I felt a pang of guilt. I have not been back for another lesson. I think perhaps I am afraid of the memory of your laughter. How can a sound bring so much joy and so much pain all at once? The head groom told me you had left instructions for him to continue my lessons. You think of everything, even when you are angry with me. Or perhaps you are not angry. Perhaps you are simply indifferent once more. I cannot decide which is worse. Day 13. You are to return tomorrow. My heart is a knot of dread and a foolish, fluttering hope. I do not know how we shall face each other. I have ruined the comfortable quiet we had, and for that, I am so deeply sorry. I am writing this because I am a coward. Because in the firelight, I should have let you kiss me. I should have told you that your fears are unfounded, but I was afraid. Because I think, no, I know, that I love you, and that is a truth I cannot bear to speak, for it has no place within the cold, hard lines of our arrangement. I have sealed my heart, and will try to be the Duchess you contracted for. I will be quiet and undemanding and will not cause you any more trouble. I must. It is the only way I will survive this. The aftermath of the storm was a profound and unnerving silence. The comfortable quiet we had built between us was gone, shattered by that one moment of raw vulnerability and retreat. In its place, a wall of strained, awkward formality rose, higher and colder than before. We became ghosts to each other once more, haunting opposite ends of the vast, silent house. Breakfast was an exercise in mutual evasion, our gazes fixed firmly on our plates. The library, once our shared sanctuary, was abandoned. I could not bring myself to enter it. So charged was it, with the memory of his confession and my failure. And he, it seemed, felt the same. I spent my days in the gardens, the winter chill a welcome distraction from the turmoil in my heart. I replayed the moment by the fire 1,000 times in my mind. He had offered me a glimpse of the man behind the title, a man who was lonely and afraid. And I, in my own cowardice, had slammed the door in his face. The shame of my reaction was a constant, bitter companion. I had spent my life building walls to protect myself, and I now found myself a prisoner behind them, unable to reach for the one person who had ever made me feel safe. A week after the storm, he sought me out in the morning parlour. He stood in the doorway, a formal, distant figure. "I find I must travel to London," he said, his voice devoid of all emotion. "Parliamentary matters require my attention. I shall be gone a fortnight." It was not a discussion. It was a pronouncement. It was also an escape. He was fleeing from the suffocating tension between us, and I could not blame him. A part of me was even relieved. But the larger part, the part that had foolishly begun to love him, felt a pain so sharp it was difficult to breathe. "I see," I said, my voice a quiet, brittle thing. "I wish you a safe journey, Your Grace." Our goodbye at the grand entrance the next morning was a portrait of cold propriety. He, formal in his travelling coat, I, the perfect, emotionless Duchess. We exchanged polite, meaningless words while the footman loaded his luggage. There was no warmth, no echo of the friendship we had so briefly shared. As his carriage pulled away down the long drive, I felt as if the last bit of warmth in the world was disappearing with it. That night, the oppressive silence of the manor became my tormentor. Every tick of the clock, every creak of the floorboards echoed the emptiness he had left behind. I could not bear it. I went to my writing desk, the place where I had allowed myself to be honest, and took out my pen. The words came in a desperate, painful flood. From the unsent letters of Penelope, Duchess of Ashworth. Day 1. Edward, you are gone, and I am a coward. That is the beginning and the end of it. The house is so still I can hear my own heart breaking. You showed me a glimpse of your true self, and I turned away. Please know, wherever you are, it was not you I was running from. It was myself. It was the girl who was told she was worthless, the girl who does not believe she is deserving of a moment of genuine tenderness. She is a powerful ghost, and I am afraid I may never be free of her. Day 4. I walked by the stables today. Bessie, the old mare, looked over her stall at me, and I felt a pang of guilt. I have not been back for another lesson. I think perhaps I am afraid of the memory of your laughter. How can a sound bring so much joy and so much pain all at once? The head groom told me you had left instructions for him to continue my lessons. You think of everything, even when you are angry with me. Or perhaps you are not angry. Perhaps you are simply indifferent once more. I cannot decide which is worse. Day 13. You are to return tomorrow. My heart is a knot of dread and a foolish, fluttering hope. I do not know how we shall face each other. I have ruined the comfortable quiet we had, and for that, I am so deeply sorry. I am writing this because I am a coward. Because in the firelight, I should have let you kiss me. I should have told you that your fears are unfounded, but I was afraid. Because I think, no, I know, that I love you, and that is a truth I cannot bear to speak, for it has no place within the cold, hard lines of our arrangement. I have sealed my heart, and will try to be the Duchess you contracted for. I will be quiet and undemanding and will not cause you any more trouble. I must. It is the only way I will survive this. The Duke had been gone for 2 weeks, and I had settled into a state of quiet, aching resignation. My heart was a sealed chamber, the unsent letters locked away in my desk a testament to a love I had resolved to bury. I spent my days performing the duties of a duchess with a detached mechanical precision. I consulted with Mrs. Gable on menus, approved the gardener's plans for the spring, and answered correspondence with a polite formality that would have made my husband proud. I was a perfect imitation of a duchess, a hollow vessel bearing his name. My performance was put to the test when an invitation arrived from the Countess of Abernathy for a charity luncheon at her estate. My first instinct was to refuse. The thought of navigating a room full of prying, aristocratic ladies without the shield of the Duke's presence was terrifying. But Jennings, the butler, presented the invitation on a silver tray with a look that was both respectful and expectant. "The Countess has been a friend of the family for many years, Your Grace," he said quietly. "Your presence would be greatly appreciated." It was not a request. It was a statement of my duty. I could not hide in the library forever. I was the Duchess of Ashworth, and I would play my part. The Abernathy estate was a lively, sunlit place, a stark contrast to the severe, masculine solemnity of Ashworth Manor. The drawing-room was filled with the chatter of 24 ladies, their gowns a rainbow of colours, their laughter bright and sharp. I moved through the room with a quiet reserve. My new title, a formidable armour. The whispers and stares I had endured my whole life were gone, replaced by respectful curtsies and an almost fawning curiosity. I was no longer the courtesan's daughter. I was a duchess, an object of fascination. The transformation was so complete it felt like a dream, and I was terrified of waking up. I was making polite conversation about the weather when the Countess herself approached, a distinguished grey-haired gentleman in tow. "Your Grace," she beamed, "I must introduce you to our guest of honour. He has been travelling abroad, and we are so fortunate to have him with us today. May I present Lord Timothy Covington, the Duke of Blackwood." I turned, a polite, meaningless smile fixed on my face, and the world stopped. The polite chatter, the clink of teacups, the scent of roses, it all faded into a dull, distant roar. It was him, older, certainly, his hair now a distinguished silver at the temples, the lines around his eyes deeper. But the eyes themselves were unmistakable. They were the same kind, sad eyes that had looked upon me with such gentle affection in our rooms on Crimson Lane. The same eyes that had watched my mother sew by the window. The same eyes that had always held a peppermint humbug and a solemn wink, just for me. It was my uncle. His own face went entirely pale, his polite smile faltering. He stared at me, his eyes wide with a disbelieving shock that mirrored my own. I could not breathe. It was as if the ghost of my 12-year-old self had risen up and was standing between us. "Your Grace," he finally managed to say, his voice a hoarse whisper. He quickly recovered his composure, turning to the Countess. "Would you forgive us, Lady Abernathy? I believe the Duchess and I are old acquaintances. I would be most grateful for a private word." He led me from the crowded room, his hand lightly on my elbow, a touch that was both strange and deeply, achingly familiar. We walked in a stunned silence to an empty conservatory at the end of the hall, the air warm and thick with the scent of orchids. The moment the glass door closed behind us, his composure crumbled. "Penelope," he breathed, his voice choked with 11 years of unshed emotion. "Is it truly you?" "Uncle." The name felt like a child's word on my tongue. "No," he said, his eyes filling with tears. "No, not your uncle." He took my hands in his grip trembling. "Penelope, I am your father." The words did not seem to make sense. "My father? But I loved your mother," he said, his voice raw with an ancient grief. "But I was trapped in a marriage I could not escape. When she died, I was heartbroken. I could not claim you. My wife was still living, and the scandal would have destroyed you. But I could not abandon you. I went to your aunt and made an arrangement. I sent her a generous sum each month for your care, your education, for everything you could ever need." He paused, his face a mask of agony, and I made the most difficult decision of my life. I chose to stay away. I knew that to keep visiting you as uncle would be a cruel lie. It would have confused your heart, given you a hope I could not fulfill until I was free. I thought it was kinder to let you believe I had simply disappeared. I chose to miss your entire childhood to protect you from that pain. My mind reeled. The money. The years of my aunt telling me there was nothing. That we were a burden. It was all a lie. She preyed on my absence, he continued, his voice thick with anger. She demanded more money, blackmailing me with the threat of exposing you to my wife. I paid whatever she asked. I thought I was ensuring your safety. He looked at me, his eyes pleading for understanding. My wife passed away 8 months ago. After a 4-month period of mourning, I went straight to your aunt's house. I was finally free to bring you home, to tell you everything. That was 4 months ago, Penelope. 4 months ago. Just after I had married Edward. But you were gone, he said, his voice breaking. Your aunt told me a monstrous lie. She said you had become wild, that you had run off with a travelling salesman weeks earlier, and she did not know where you were. For 4 months, my child. I have been searching for a lost, destitute girl. I have had men in every port. I have followed every rumour, fearing you were alone and in terrible danger. And all this time you were here. He looked around the grand estate, his gaze finally landing on my face. As the Duchess of Ashworth, the pieces all clicked into place. A horrifying, perfect mosaic of deceit. My aunt's greed, her cruelty, the stolen money, the lie to cover it all. The shame I had carried my entire life was not my own. It was a fiction she had crafted to enrich herself. I was not the unwanted child of a fallen woman. I was the daughter of a tragic, profound love. A daughter whose father had made a terrible sacrifice to protect her, only to be betrayed. Penelope, my father said, taking my hand, his tears now falling freely. My child. I thought I had lost you forever. In the warm, sunlit conservatory, I felt the ghost of the courtesan's daughter, the girl who had been born in shame, finally, truly, begin to fade away. My father insisted on accompanying me back to Ashworth Manor himself. I felt dazed, as if I were walking through a dream, the world remade in the space of a single afternoon. He waited in the carriage as I went inside. My mind a whirlwind of shock and a joy so profound it was almost painful. I went straight to my rooms. The opulence that had once seemed so alien now feeling like a distant, irrelevant fact. I packed a small bag with enough things for a few days, my hands trembling. I was going to spend time with my father. Before I left, I went to the library. The room was silent, empty. His absence was a physical presence. On his great oak desk, I placed my note. Your Grace, I wrote, my handwriting shaky. I have been unexpectedly reunited with my father, Lord Covington, the Duke of Blackwood. I am well. I will be staying with him for a few days at his rooms at the Royal Hotel in town. I will send word upon my return. Penelope. I hesitated, then fled before I could lose my nerve. The next day was a blur of conversation, of catching up on a lifetime of missed moments. It was late in the afternoon, as my father and I were taking tea, that the butler announced the arrival of the Duke of Ashworth. My heart leaped into my throat. My father rose to greet him as he was shown in. Edward was impeccably dressed, but as he entered the room, I felt a chill. There was a cold, tense unease radiating from him that I had never felt before. He was polite. He greeted my father with a formal, correct bow. Lord Covington, he said, his voice even, I am pleased to see you in good health. Your Grace, my father replied, thank you for coming. Penelope has told me a great deal about your kindness. The two dukes chatted for a few minutes. I sat between them, my entire being attuned to the strange, simmering energy coming from my husband. He was not himself. This was not the weary, quiet man from the library. This was a stranger, his composure a thin sheet of ice over something volatile. After a few minutes of the unbearable, polite conversation, he turned his gaze to me. Your Grace, he said, the title a cold formality. I must request a private word with my wife. My father graciously offered us the use of the small study. The moment the door closed behind us, the atmosphere became suffocating. Edward walked past me and stood before the window, his back to me. The silence stretched, a taut wire of suspense. How long? He asked, his voice low and tight. I was bewildered. "Your Grace." "Do not trifle with my feelings, Penelope," he said, the words sharp, laced with an emotion I could not name. "How long?" He turned his head slightly, his profile a hard, unforgiving line against the light. "How long have you had feelings for me? I saw your letters." The world tilted on its axis. A hot, violent blush flooded my entire body. He knew. "My Grace, please," I stammered, my voice a horrified whisper. "It was a foolish mistake. Very He whipped around, his grey eyes blazing. "So now you are calling it foolish? Is that it?" he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He started towards me. "The most honest words I have ever read, and you dismiss them as foolish?" He was in front of me now. So close I could feel the heat of his anger. I could not bear the intensity of his gaze, and I lowered my head, staring at the floor. "You weren't supposed to see them," I whispered. He lifted a hand and tilted my chin up, forcing me to meet his eyes. "No," he said, his voice softer now, but no less intense. "I was not—" And then he shut me up with a kiss. It was not gentle. It was a kiss of anger and frustration and a desperate, starving hunger that stole the breath from my lungs. It was sweet and punishing all at once, an overwhelming claiming that left no room for thought. He broke away, his chest heaving, his hands still cupping my face. I stared at him, my lips tingling, my mind a complete blank. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice a raw, broken whisper. "You have no idea how you have tortured me all these months. And you are so blind." I tried to form a word, an apology, but he gave a low groan and shut me up again with another kiss. Deeper this time. Slower. A kiss that spoke of a profound and desperate longing. When he finally pulled back, he rested his forehead against mine. His eyes closed. "Penelope," he breathed, "I have loved you from the first time I ever saw you." I looked at him, stunned into a sacred disbelief. "You were in the bakery," he said, his voice thick with the memory. "Old Mrs. Higgins was there, confused. She was shouting at you, accusing you of giving her the wrong loaf. I recall how hysterical she became. And you were so humble. You simply smiled and calmed her and helped her count her coins, never losing your patience. I had never seen such quiet, unshakable grace." He opened his eyes, and they were filled with the truth of his words. "I started coming to the bakery just to see you. A man could never eat 3 loaves of bread in a week. I learned you wore a small, yellow canary pin in your hair on Thursdays. I saw the smudge of flour you always had on your left cheek, and I ached with the impossibility of it all. The proposal, it was all a desperate plan to bring you into my world, where I hoped I might have a chance to make you see me." He pulled me into a deep, secure embrace, holding me tightly against his chest. I could feel the thud of his heart, or perhaps it was my own. After a long moment of profound peace, he murmured into my hair, his voice low and vulnerable. "There. I have said my piece. So, what do you think, Penelope?" I could not answer. The full weight of his love, the release from a lifetime of shame, the sheer, impossible joy of it all was too much. I clutched onto him and began to sob, my body shaking with all the pain and fear and loneliness I had ever felt, all of it finally washing away in a flood of cathartic tears. I cried for what felt like an eternity, and he just held me, murmuring my name, his hand stroking my hair. When the sobs finally quieted, I pulled back just enough to look up at him, my eyes shining. "I love you so much, Edward," I whispered. "I find it hard to breathe when you are not with me." A year had passed, a year in which the world had remade itself in colours I had never known. The seasons had turned, bringing a gentle spring thaw, and now the glorious, unrestrained warmth of high summer had settled over Ashworth Manor. I sat on a stone bench in the rose garden, the very one I had planned with the gardeners in the spring, now a riot of fragrant, vibrant blooms. The afternoon sun was warm on my face, and I rested a hand on the gentle curve of my stomach, where our child, our son, grew beneath my heart. The peace I felt was so profound, so complete, that it still sometimes felt like a dream from which I was terrified of waking. "He will have your eyes, I think," a gentle voice said. I looked up to see my father, Lord Timothy, smiling down at me. He had become a constant, joyous presence in our lives, his sadness finally replaced by a quiet, doting contentment. "And Edward's stubborn chin, I fear," I laughed, and he joined me. We sat in a comfortable silence for a moment, watching the bees hum amongst the roses. He had told me countless stories of my mother, Ruth, filling in the faded outlines of my memory with the vibrant colours of his love for her. In finding him, I had found the missing half of myself. Edward appeared at the end of the garden path, walking towards us. He was no longer the severe, solitary figure from the library. Love had softened the hard lines of his face, replacing his weariness with a deep, steady calm. He smiled as he approached, a genuine, easy smile that was still a private miracle to me. He bent to kiss my forehead, his hand coming to rest over mine on my stomach. "Walking again without me, my love?" he murmured, his voice a low, teasing rumble. "You see the torture she puts me through, Covington?" My father chuckled. "She is her mother's daughter, full of spirit." The two men, once strangers, now shared an easy, respectful friendship, bound by their mutual love for me. Seeing them together, my father and my husband, filled my heart with a warmth so complete it felt as though it might overflow. That weekend, we attended a garden party at the Abernathy estate. As we moved through the crowd, I saw them, Rosalind Thorne and Beatrice Finch. They were standing with a group of ladies, their chatter faltering as they saw us approach. I felt Edward's hand tighten protectively on my arm. A year ago, the sight of them would have sent me fleeing. Now, I simply met their gaze. I watched as they, along with the rest of their circle, dropped into a deep formal curtsy. "Your Grace," Rosalind murmured, her eyes fixed on the ground. There was no triumph in me, no desire for revenge, only a quiet, final acknowledgement of a battle that had been won. I gave them a polite ducal nod, and we walked on. Later that evening, as Edward and I sat on the terrace watching the stars appear, I thought of my aunt. We had heard news of her only once. My father's solicitors had dealt with the matter of her theft and blackmail with ruthless, quiet efficiency. Faced with irrefutable proof, she and Mr. Croft had sold the bakery and left the town in the dead of night, disappearing into a shroud of utter disgrace. My father had provided a small, separate pension for my Uncle Arthur, who now lived quietly by the sea. The ghosts of that grim little house had been laid to rest. We ended the night where our story had truly begun. In the library, a gentle summer breeze drifted through the open windows, carrying the scent of night-blooming jasmine. He came to stand behind my armchair, his hands coming to rest on my shoulders, his chin resting on the top of my head. "The house is never cold anymore," I whispered, thinking of the foolish, heartfelt words from my letters. "No," he murmured into my hair. "It is not." He turned me around in the chair to face him, crouching down so his eyes were level with mine. The firelight danced in their grey depths, but it was not the only light there. There was a warmth that was entirely his own, a love that was entirely for me. "My wild, foolish, blind Penelope," he said, his voice thick with an emotion that still made my heart ache with joy. "The girl with the yellow canary in her hair." "A duchess now?" I reminded him softly, a smile playing on my lips. "Yes," he said, his smile matching mine. "My duchess." He leaned in and kissed me, a soft, tender kiss full of the promise of 1,000 more quiet, wondrous nights like this one, in the arms of my husband, the beast of Ashworth. The courtesan's daughter was finally, truly, and completely home.